Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. We have people here joining us from certainly North America, but from many, many other parts of the world, including Australia, Denmark, Dubai, Germany, Iceland, the UK, Romania, South Africa, and many more parts of the world. So again, we just want to welcome you to today's webinar on CQ and inclusive leadership. My name is Dr. Sandra Upton, and I am the Vice President of Global Diversity Practice at the Cultural Intelligence Center. That means that I oversee all of the work that we do as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the work that we are doing with our partners all across the world. And again, just delighted that you have joined us for this very important and exciting topic. We had a record number of people register for this webinar, so you also felt that it was important. And before we get into the content, I just want to give you a few quick webinar notes to make sure we're all on the same page. So all of you will be muted. We've got a wonderful team of panelists who will be sharing over the next 45 to 50 minutes. During that time, you will be muted and unable to speak or share. If for some reason you get cut off, just simply call back using the same Zoom link that you used when you initially joined the webinar. We are planning to have a very short Q&A towards the end of our time together today. So if you would like to ask a question, you can feel free to type that question in the Q&A box, and our team will be monitoring those throughout the session. And then we will attempt to answer as many of those questions as we possibly can during the Q&A. And for those of you that may want to come back and listen to this later, or perhaps share the information with some of your colleagues and peers, the webinar will be recorded and available for access within the next 24 hours on our CQ Center website. And I emphasize that this recording is available. We like to apologize to our partners and friends in Southeast Asia and parts of the world where the timing of this webinar is just simply not conducive to that time zone. We are very aware of that and very sensitive to that. And so one of the ways that we've attempted to accommodate is to make sure that the recording is, that the webinar is recorded and available to anyone at any time after we are done today. So with that, I just want to jump into things a bit and give some context. This webinar is it is live right now on our YouTube channel, and I want to encourage those of you that are listening, if you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, it is not too late to do that. So go and subscribe to that so that you can be connected with us in that way as well. But before I introduce our panelists, or allow our panelists to introduce themselves, I want to do a little level setting here. You know, the conversation today is all about cultural intelligence and inclusive leadership. And I know that there are many people that are joining us who are already friends and partners with us, but I'm suspecting that there may be some new faces that may be joining and that may not know a lot about cultural intelligence. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean when we say cultural intelligence and what we mean when we say inclusive leadership. And we're going to hear from the panelists because they may have some different definitions related to inclusive leadership, but I want to at least give some basic definitions here. So when we talk about cultural intelligence, it's simply the capability to function and relate effectively in culturally diverse situations. And those situations can be both in the domestic and international context. The focus is on skill, so it goes beyond this idea of being sensitive to cultural differences or developing our awareness as it relates to cultural differences. Those are both important things, but at the end of the day, it's all about developing the capability or the skill to work effectively across different cultural situations. When we think about that, as it relates to inclusive leadership, and we think about that partnership, I love the definition that the Center for Creative Leadership developed as it relates to inclusive leadership. And you can see that here on the screen. Inclusive leadership means that leaders commit to ensuring all team members are treated equitably, they feel a sense of belonging and value, and they have the resources and support that they need to achieve their full potential. And I think that is, again, a perfect summary of what we are thinking when we talk about inclusive leadership. When we think about the relationship, again, between CQ and inclusive leadership, we really kind of go back to a wonderful piece that Deloitte wrote a few years back, and they've enhanced it and done sort of a newer version recently. But initially, they did a piece back in 2016, I believe, that was titled 6 Signature Traits of an Inclusive Leader. And as you can see on the screen here, of the 6 traits, they highlight cultural intelligence as one of those traits. In addition to that, you can see cognizance, courage, commitment, collaboration, and curiosity. And we could not agree more with them that cultural intelligence is an important trait that inclusive leaders need to have. But I would go a step further and argue that even when you look at those other 5 traits, you really need cultural intelligence in order to implement those or to act on those areas. And when you look at CQ and you think about the 4 capabilities, and you can see those highlighted here on the screen, we believe that CQ is what gives leaders the skills and confidence to effectively lead diverse teams. And when you look at these 4 capabilities, you could actually easily drop the other 5 traits into one of these capabilities. So at the end of the day, we believe that CQ really is core and foundational to inclusive leadership, and it then helps to enable those other 5 traits to come alive. So with that, what I'd like to do, I'm going to allow our panelists, because they're going to have a lot to say about this, but I'm going to allow each of them to take about 30 seconds to introduce themselves to you, and then we're going to get into the questions and conversation. So Amri, we'll start with you.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to be with you today. My name is Amri Johnson. I'm a Kansan that is based in Switzerland. So that's kind of number one. I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I started off in public health as an epidemiologist, and then over time moved into diversity and inclusion from my work in health disparities in public health into this work in corporate diversity. I run a firm called Inclusion Wins based here in Basel. I live here with my 3 kids, 2 teenagers and a 2-year-old. It's great to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Amri. So glad that you're here. Gary.
Good morning, colleagues and friends from all over the world. This is a really exciting opportunity to interact. I'm Gary Cormier, and my background, I've been in human resources for about 35 years. The first 25 have been in a corporate environment. The last decade has been at Harvard University. And my passion is really for training and OD work. And over the last few years, it's been focused in the DEIB space. We built a number of workshops throughout Harvard to address all the issues related to this important area. I just want to share very quickly how we came upon CQ. Back in 2014, we had run a diversity dialogue series and invited David Livermore, who you may know as the PhD and president of the Cultural Intelligence Center, to come in and speak to us, just to offer some guidance on developing CQ in our community. Fast forward 7 years later, we've had cohorts of colleagues go through certification in both cultural intelligence and unconscious bias. And it's alive and well throughout Harvard University. And to this day in my school, I think we've got roughly 900 colleagues who've been through training. So shameless plug for the people at CQ. They're phenomenal to work with. They're great partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. We appreciate that and are very grateful for our partnership with Harvard. Dr. Schumacher.
Good day, everyone. I'm Dr. Lillian Schumacher, president of Tiffin University in Ohio, and have spent most of my professional life in higher education. I was in the corporate world previous to that. I've also lived around the world most of my life and have had the wonderful opportunities to firsthand experience different cultures. At Tiffin University, I became president in 2016, and since then, we've been working very, very hard to integrate cultural intelligence throughout the institution, whether we're talking about within the curriculum for all of our undergraduate students. We actually even have a PhD in global leadership and change, and really infused it not only in our curriculum for our students, but also in our organizational fabric, and looking forward to talking with you about that today.
Thank you so much. And forgive me, Dr. Schumacher.
No worries.
Thank you. Tina.
Hello, thank you so much, Sandra. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Tina Mary, lead consultant with the Cultural Intelligence Center, and I'm based in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I spent over 2 decades in high tech in the games industry. I spent time living in Romania, in Sweden, in UK, spent time in Russia and Asia and Spain and Argentina. And for me, the conversation around culture was ubiquitous. I was always trying to translate operationally, how do we get better at working across culturally diverse and globally diverse teams. So when I came across CQ in 2018, massive aha moment, went to meet Dr. Livermore, got certified, and have started my journey since then. So joining full-time last year in September with the company, it's been a dream and I love my work. And I'm really honored to be part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Tina. And as you all have already heard, we've got a very diverse team of panelists who very much have experience in this space on a global scale. And so I want to emphasize that this is not just a North America conversation by any means, but it is very much something that impacts all of us all over the world. So with that, I am going to get into the meat of our conversation today and give each of the panelists opportunity to share their thoughts on this relationship between CQ and inclusive leadership. So I want to start out by just asking this question. Organizations and leaders are all over, as you were talking earlier, Amri, are making this commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity, or whatever we want to call it. We all call it different things, and depending on our organization and where we are in the world. But so often, even still now, we use the language, we've increased our hiring for chief diversity officers, all of that, but there's still quite a bit of emphasis on the diversity piece and not enough on the inclusion piece, right? So on a fundamental level, what do you think needs to happen or change in organizations to move them towards creating more inclusive cultures? And I'm gonna start with you, Amri, and then go from there.
Sandra, you started with a pretty big question. And, I think it's a little bit different for every organization, but the first thing that I think organizations need to do is make sure that they don't separate this work, as we often call it, from the business. So this work is the business. This is an integral part into your growth. It's an integral part into your organizational design. And when you talk about your organizational design, it's everything from your strategy through the people that are going to fulfill on that strategy and everything in between. So I think when we think about this as integral to who we are and to all the systems in our organization, it's critical that we put this into practice. So it's not a fixed thing, like I must do X, Y, and Z. I must do this, and then we're going to be inclusive. It's a series of inputs, capabilities, and outputs. And so you have to be clear about what you're trying to create. I like to say you need to be clear about making sure that everybody thrives, all teams thrive, the organization thrives, and always constantly iterating and experimenting and learning how to do that better. But then the inputs, are a series of things. I've had people focus on psychological safety and really create inclusive culture. I've had others focus on CQ and create an inclusive culture, but the gap is always the capabilities and skills. So there's a lot of willingness, but there's always, oftentimes, not so much skillfulness. So making sure you kind of couple those things so the capabilities are there so you can sustain the work. So diversity is great and you have to get representation right, but it probably won't be sustainable if you don't have the environment and have the right inputs, clarity about the outputs, and then the capabilities that one needs to build to sustain these things for the long haul, to continuously enhance the business towards everyone thriving.
Yeah, that's great, Amri. And Gary, I see you nodding, so I'm going to jump over to you. And I'm going to add a twist to this, because one of the things that we emphasize is that, even the diversity piece, that's so huge, right? It's so many forms of diversity that we need to be thinking about being inclusive. That's a tall order, right? So Gary, can you speak a little bit to, again, how do we help them think about this in a more inclusive way? And how do we help them think about getting to all of those different forms of diversity that are represented in our organizations?
Absolutely. I want to pick up on something that Amri just mentioned about psychological safety. In my work, both within and outside of Harvard, many organizations are looking for some kind of a foundation to begin to do the work. So it could be promoting an environment where everyone feels safe to speak up and share failure and share concerns. It could also be just building in an organization an understanding of civility. Another topic that can lead you right into DEIB. What I have found is most effective, and I truly believe this to be the case, you have to have some level of leadership commitment in order to build inclusive leadership. So what I mean by that is you have to get a leadership team together to really kind of wrestle at a strategic level about what it means for them and what they're going to do about it. Otherwise, a lot of the other work around structure and systems and training may fall flat. You need executive sponsorship at the top in order to really promote an inclusive environment. The other thing I want to say is this is not a definition that's static. It's changed a lot in the last year. I will admit that the continuous learning and the need for a construct on anti-racism has become most prevalent in the past year around inclusive leadership. I wouldn't have said that a few years ago like I would say it today.
Yeah, that's great, Gary. Thank you. Dr. Schumacher, I would love for you to kind of add your thoughts to that question.
Yeah, I think in addition to what my two colleagues have said, I definitely agree with the top-down commitment. I think the CEO has to be committed to this because, they're at the fundamental level, there's no magic bullet here. This is not a kind of one thing, one time, and it's over. And so I think the first part fundamentally is to admit that you want to actually make your organization more inclusive and then actually have a commitment to doing the work. And you have to stay the course for a long period of time, dare I say forever, because I'm not sure it's really, really a journey and not necessarily a destination that you ever really get to. It's about complex whole systems change. I mean, that's really what it's about. And it takes time, it takes committed behaviors, standards of accountability that you build into your organization, and really having to have measurable outcomes as a result of that. And it's complex and complicated work. Because people are very messy and human behavior is messy, right? And so, really having a commitment to that is critical. And knowing that, all of us have implicit and unconscious bias, and being able to really commit to knowing that is just part of life and part of who we are, and a willingness to learn and adapt from these biases has to be part of that educational journey for individuals. And the last thing I'll say is, individuals need to really, really start with a sense of self-awareness. I think that is critical. If we're really going to change behavior and address this fundamentally, we have to really, really start with ourselves and say, how are we willing to address this, and where do we know that we experience our own biases with respect to this? And don't be afraid to just stay the course. In our organization, it took us a long time just to come up with language that we could always all agree on that would mean the same thing to everybody. That period in and of itself took about 18 months for us. So I think it's just important to remember that this is truly a process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, I just have to reiterate your emphasis on the fact that you cannot do this work and it be sustainable if we don't look at it both at the individual and systems level. And I probably say this every time we do a webinar, whether we're talking about inclusive leadership or racial equity, but that is just a simple fact. It's not simple to do, but it's a simple fact that you have to look at that whole systems approach. I love that. And then that individual behavior, so important. Tina, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I really love what was shared, and I want to touch back for a moment on what Amri mentioned around context. I think when we talk about the why are we doing this, is there a clear understanding? Yes, it's all the right thing to do, but when we talk about the why, we can start getting more into what does inclusion mean to us and how do we foster that culture? What are the overarching OKRs and goals that we can set for ourselves so that we can start measuring our actions through KPIs? And, again, going back to this idea that it's a journey, absolutely agree. It's not a box that we can tick. It's got to become part of the corporate culture and just part of the way that we operate and do business. And that's not going to be something, for Dr. Schumacher's point, that's going to just happen overnight, right? It's going to take time. It's going to take intention. So I would say the overarching thing for me is, yes, you need those champions, those sponsors, and then they need to start building conversations around the why, so we can trickle it all the way down to clear actions and KPIs and things that we can actually measure and move forward with.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. That's great. And I want to step back and think about the definition. So, Dr. Schumacher, you talked about how it took you 18 months just for everybody to determine a definition or definitions and then all be on the same page in terms of language. So I started out and I gave the definitions of cultural intelligence as well as the definition of inclusive leadership. Can each of you talk a little bit about do you agree with the definition that I gave, or is there something you would add or take from that? And then most importantly, why does CQ matter? What's that connection? What is that marriage? Why is that so critical? Okay, so I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Schumacher, and let you start us out with a response to that question.
So actually, I love that definition. As I was, thinking about what I wanted to share today, that was exactly the same definition that I picked from the center. So I agree with it. And even more importantly, Sandra, I think it's what you talked about, that cultural intelligence is really truly at the core of this. And I'm not just saying this because we're partnering with the Cultural Intelligence Center. It truly is, because if, CQ matters, because if you're really going to have an inclusive model, there has to be the self-awareness that I talked about, the empathy, this humility about the work that we're doing, the awareness of bias, as I said before, and this interest and curiosity in others, right? And among other examples. And if you look at really the foundation of the 4 areas of cultural intelligence, that really is what it measures. And I think it is, to put it into KPIs, if you will, and really taking, if you will, a playbook that an individual can work towards improving or enhancing over time. This really, really does. It's a great formula to develop inclusive leadership perspective and mindset, first in the individual, and then being able to do that in an organizational setting. So I absolutely concur with that definition of inclusive leadership. And I think CQ matters, because if you're really going to have that kind of model, you have to have these aspects of what CQ really measures.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tina, your thoughts on that?
Again, I think I absolutely would echo everything that was just said. And I love that definition as well. To me, what really resonated was this idea that I need unique things. We all need something unique from leaders. So how do I respect the uniqueness of the needs of my team and show up differently? I do need to be culturally agile. I do need to show up differently as a leader. So CQ matters because it's going to help me do that. It's going to help me suspend the bias of what great leadership looks like and show up differently when I need to help my team do great work. So I think that we need CQ. CQ matters because diversity matters. And there's no way that we can leverage the diversity of our teams if we're not fostering an inclusive leadership mindset.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina. Gary.
I would just add that when I got certified in cultural intelligence, I learned how many organizations had international ties to their structure, and how important it is to think about it from a merger and acquisition standpoint, and how important it is for an organization to really appreciate cultural differences before they actually go in and merge. I worked with an outside client who was using a strategy to acquire their distributors around the world as opposed to trying to compete with them. But in doing that, they brought in cultural intelligence so that they really listened to what was important around the world from a cultural standpoint. And what they learned was there is a cultural DNA in every organization that you're going to encounter, and how important it is to appreciate that before you go in and acquire anybody. And so as a result, that's one of the few mergers I've seen in my 35 years in human resources that's been a huge success. The other thing I wanted to share, I think it's important to think about this work as leaving nobody behind. So think about people from other cultures that are a part of your organization and wanting inclusion to include a state of being where everyone feels belonged in an organization. And in that way, you can use cultural intelligence work to promote diversity around the world and to promote inclusive leadership.
Yeah, that's great, Gary. Thank you so much. Amri, your thoughts on that?
Thanks. I'll tell a quick story. It wasn't a successful story, but it gave me a lot of learning about the notion of inclusive leadership and the intersection with CQ. I was leading a global project focused on creating really life work kind of strategy for a large organization that I was a part of. And I had one colleague that was really driving the flex work part of the life work flexibility, life work balance strategy. And she was a peer, fantastic. We got along really well. But I'd been working on this within my smaller division for a long time, and I figured it out. I knew what was going on. So I was telling her a lot of stuff that I thought she needed to do. And I thought I was being really helpful. But I was not taking into consideration her values around how leadership worked. She was responsible for that project. And particularly as a peer, I was coming in and stepping on her territory, and I didn't have the authority to do that because I wasn't senior to her. And so me giving her information occurred to her like I was telling her what to do. It totally went over my head, and I got certified in CQ and have been practicing it since 2011. But in that particular instance, I wasn't utilizing that capability. So it's not just, I agree with the Center for Creative Leadership's definition, but for me, it's the ability to recognize and create the conditions for your people, your teams, and your organization to thrive. And that means you have to recognize when things are in the middle, you're in the middle of something and you're not taking it in the direction that you need to take it in, and be able to pivot so that you can, recognize those things that aren't working. And for me, that's where CQ and the intersection with leadership is so critical, is to make sure that you can recognize things when they're going well, and that you can continue to add, add spice to that. And then also recognize when you need to pivot, step back, do a little bit better perspective taking so you can be more effective in any situation that you might be in at a particular time.
Yeah, that's great, Amri. Thank you. If I were listening into this conversation, I would say, boy, this is great. I really am getting a clear picture that, inclusive leadership is a critical thing that we have to have going forward. CQ is really the perfect one of the solutions that we can build into that process to become more inclusive and create more inclusive organizations. But how does this actually work? When we think about it from a measurement perspective, how do I, some of this stuff can feel quite nebulous. How do I measure? If we're going to focus on, one of you mentioned earlier, let's say you decide that you want to focus on psychological safety. Your goal is to just create an environment where everyone feels comfortable bringing their authentic selves to the organization. How do you measure that? So can you talk a little bit about what are some of the ways an inclusive leader who is on this journey, it's never a destination, but who's on this journey, ways in which they can measure progress and success? So maybe we'll go back to you, Tina, and have you start us out with some thoughts around that.
Yeah. I would say probably the most common one here is engagement surveys. We're asking people very explicitly, do you feel safe? Do you feel your opinions count? Do you feel they can be shared? We're sending those surveys in a way that are administered by a third party so that staff can feel safe, that their anonymity is being respected and understood. And we're analyzing the demographics behind those engagement surveys, which is a piece that sometimes is missed. So we might see that on a macro level, people feel safe in the organization, but are there marginalized groups that maybe feel less safe and less included in the whole? And then the other piece is one-on-ones. As an inclusive leader, I need to be talking to people. I need to be having meaningful connections with my team, with others in the organization, and finding out the pulse on a one-on-one level. So those are a couple of ideas that I would have. And of course, if we look at the skills, the capabilities, that we need to show up as an inclusive leader. We, of course, got cultural intelligence. We can measure it, we can develop it, and we can show tangible improvements to those outcomes in the predictive results of CQ.
Yeah, that's great, Tina. Thank you. Gary, what would you add to that?
Well, I think it's changed a little bit for us at Harvard. Over the past year, we felt the need to make it more of an informal conversation. So we had an approach to DEIB where we called it "What's Needed Now," and every one of the dialogues kind of was more organic than it would have been, in a more formal, planned way, because so many things have come at us over the past year that required people to just open up and share and react. And so the formality of what you do, the interesting thing about what's the number one thing you can do, you almost have to accept that there really is no number one thing you can do. I would say that having a shared definition of DEIB is probably most important in an organization. But everything we said about people bringing their authentic selves, even when it's uncomfortable, and it's been really uncomfortable, is critical to really launch this approach to inclusive leadership, because we're reacting to the world around us right now, and the reactions are important to address.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. Lillian, your thoughts?
Completely agree with what both colleagues have said. And, surveys and getting feedback from individuals is absolutely critical. I would also say that if you're going to make a commitment to this work, you need to put it in your strategic plan. So, for your organization, it needs to be part of your strategic priorities, and you need to measure that process and continuously evaluate that on a regular basis. And what we've done at the institution is we've, as I shared before, embedded global and domestic diversity and inclusion competencies into our academic curricula. And we measure these. We measure our students' learning on a regular basis, and they go through their entire undergraduate curriculum, and we're measuring along the way. We're doing the same for our employees, and really making sure that not only is it in our strategic priorities, but that we fund this, right? So that there's financial commitment to this work as well. And then the other thing that we've done, which again holds us accountable to the process and making sure that we're continuing through this journey and evaluating it on a regular basis, is we've created an advisory council to the president, and we call our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion at Tiffin University, we call it Celebrating Cultural Uniqueness, so CCU at TU. And what we do is we have representatives from across our institution that meet on a regular basis under 3 sub-councils to the President's Advisory Council. One is around academic excellence to ensure that the curriculum is what we say it is. And again, we're evaluating that. Talent and engagement, so making sure that we're doing all that we can to recruit the most diverse group of employees that we possibly can, and educate that group of employees. And then making sure, that the compliance part of diversity, if you will, the Title IX pieces, and that whole compliance part of this dialogue and this conversation is also being taken into consideration. So we call that the Expansion and Opportunity Sub-Council of our President's Advisory Council. So, meeting regularly, holding this accountable, and again, having it in your strategic plan and making sure you financially are committing to this, I think is definitely a way to measure the impact.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Amri, your thoughts?
I think my colleagues gave some great examples. I tend to advise people to have leading and lagging indicators. So you don't always know what's working, but it's probably not one thing. So you need to kind of look at the various inputs that you have. So if you're thinking about team dynamics, how is team inclusion impacting the outcomes for projects? How are teams evaluating peers? How are you on team members evaluating how they're working together? Not to be punitive, but to be an opportunity to learn and kind of lean in the process on a regular basis. When things are going well, to celebrate it, but also when things aren't going well, to know what tools do we need to make sure we do better, and are we really utilizing and understanding if we work with CQ, Are we really strategizing when we come together? If we're a team that has a greater level of distinctions, difference, attributes, how are we working through that when we have a conflict? So being able to have some type of team measurement, I think, is really important. And it's a little bit of a leading and can be a lagging measure or an outcome measure as well. The other thing that I think could be really important as a leading measure is I think Gary mentioned this, is these dialogues one-to-one and sometimes one-to-team about how the leader is impacting the way that the group creates and the group produces. And is the leader giving them what they need to thrive? Is the leader sharing information enough, for example? Is the leader listening and having enough perspective taking or empathy in the process of high stakes projects or in the process of high stress in a particular time in the organization? Is the leader, walking the talk? And so it's a way for us to be constantly in the process of getting better rather than waiting to see. I think engagement surveys are great, but they happen, periodically, and some people do post surveys, which is great too, but they're usually kind of lagging. They might happen for most organizations once a year, sometimes less. And it's a little too late. So what are you seeing that's going on? Things that we think are important, practices that we have seen have been effective, getting a sense of how people feel, telling stories about that, things that weren't so shiny, as well as things that shine like a precious jewel. So I think the storytelling, making sure you have leading and lagging indicators, and always being in constant dialogue with one another, with the care, not just to find fault or to look good, but really to care about how this interdependence that we're trying to create is being facilitated and lived.
Yeah, that's great. I hope our participants are taking notes, because that was a long list of ways in which we can measure our progress. And I would just add and really build on to a number of the comments that were made by each of you. But I love the idea. The accountability piece is so critical. And so as inclusive leaders, we have to make sure that we're not just creating plans for work for everybody else, but we're not making the commitment to do the work ourselves. And part of that is just our own personal growth and development. And how are we holding ourselves accountable, whether it's an advisory board that's giving us feedback, whether it's a mentor, or we get a sponsor, or we get a leader that's really getting it right in another organization, and we ask them to mentor us. So that commitment by the leader to get on their own growth journey is incredibly important to that process, and measuring that by getting feedback from others. You're hitting the mark or you're missing it. And I think the other piece too, I see so many organizations, when they engage in this work, they take what I call the activity approach versus the results approach. We just start doing a bunch of things, and they may be really good things, but we have no clue if they're the right things. And we certainly don't know whether or not they're working or not. And so even that step back in that journey to do some kind of assessment of where you really are. Where are we as an organization in terms of our efforts around inclusiveness? And then based on where we are on that journey, then what are the appropriate strategies to put in place? And then how will we measure those? But sometimes we completely miss that first big step, and we just jump in and we're all over the map. So I think that's important, but just some great suggestions here. And I think, again, there's no one way, but it's a combination of, I think the organic conversations can be incredibly powerful. And that's another way to get pulse on a very regular basis on how things are going. So excellent ideas here. So let's keep going down that pathway of solutions, because I know that's what people want to hear. So we gave them a very nice list of the different ways that we can measure impact. What are some other best practices or practical culturally intelligent strategies that leaders can do to move the organization along that journey of becoming an inclusive organization? So I want to just hear you share some very practical CQ solutions that you've seen happen, that you've, Amri, in your case, perhaps that you're doing all of this amazing consulting work with organizations around the world. What are you encouraging them to do that we know works and that are, again, very practical things?
I always struggle with best practices, to be honest with you, because
Mhm.
I mean, I've had some practices with some groups and I tried them with others and they were completely horrible. So
Mhm.
they were best for at the time for that particular group, but they weren't best for everybody. So one thing that I do spend a lot of time doing is helping people look at generative solutions for where they are. So we work with appreciative inquiry a lot, and we kind of dive into what's working, what's at the core of who you are and who you want to be. So that becomes part of them thinking about what they're trying to create, and is there anything getting in the way of it. So some folks, I had an honor to talk to some folks from Lego, and Lego Group does this work where their leadership capability is about energy. And so are you energized by the engagement with one another, or are you being de-energized by it? And it's not a matter of like, you're de-energizing and you're bad. It's like, in this particular dynamic, energy is not coming at us. And what do we need to do to step back and have that conversation? So to have something that your organization centers on and feels like is really their thing, and to elevate it to say, are we doing this in this particular situation? When we come into conflict, are we energizing are we energized by each other, for example? And then if not, you step back and you say, well, what's getting in the way? And when you start thinking about it from a cultural intelligence perspective, there could be all kinds of mixtures of culture that are going on in there. And how are we actually able to back off? That could be anything from values to the culture of your discipline, or the culture of your business unit, or the culture of where you're geographically located, that might be causing a rift in that generative notion that you say is really important and at the core of who your organization is. So I spend a lot of time trying to get to the core. I don't spend a lot of time looking for problems. We've done enough of that in D&I. I'm looking for what's working, and what, the barriers naturally come up, but it's a barrier to what you're trying to create. It's not the barrier and the problem. It's a barrier to what's already core to who you are. Most organizations wouldn't have survived if they didn't have something working. So we dig into that, and then we elevate it and talk about it, and then use the capabilities like CQ, to dig into it when it's working, and to do it better and be even better than we were before. And when it's not working, really asking ourselves what's going on here that we need to step back and look at a little bit closer.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it ties, again, another way to tie it to CQ, because our overall approach is all about, I call it the 2 Ps. There's the punitive approach and there's the potential approach. And so when you add CQ to that equation of already looking at what we're doing right and what are those core things, as we use CQ, it's all about, again, the possibilities and the potential to be better. I love that. Thanks. Gary, your thoughts?
Just a few added thoughts. I was thinking about how you can have a value proposition around DEIB, but if you don't really get to the root cause of what might be preventing it, you won't make a lot of progress. So I'll give a couple of examples. One is, we have a dean in my school who's really promoting having expanded diverse searches for senior level talent. What we realized is, until you address an issue like affinity bias, it's very difficult for people to get on board with a goal like having an expanded diverse search. So it does start with knowing yourself and knowing what are your own biases before you can actually extend into an action that shows results. Another example, I remember last year, Harvard had a shutdown STEM day. And for one day, faculty and staff and students were told to use the day to kind of have hard discussions. But what we realized very quickly was what they needed, like what Amri just said about appreciative inquiry, what they needed was to learn how to engage in difficult conversations. So we brought in Sheila Heen from the law school to have a session with faculty and senior staff on how to engage in a difficult conversation. Because when you say things like, we're going to shut down for a day and have you talk about issues of racism, people need to have tools in order to engage in that dialogue. So all I'm trying to say is, whenever you have a value proposition, you have to back it up with action so people feel ready to get into this tough area of dialogue.
Yeah, that's great, Gary. Thank you so much. Dr. Schumacher, what would you add to that?
Just a couple things that we've been talking about. One thing that I don't think we've mentioned is, or at least directly, is I think when you're looking at this work, it's really important to know that there are some great resource groups out there. And so obviously, you know, to really connect with some of those other groups is important, because you know, you don't want to do this alone. There's so many different ways to go about this work. And so really connecting with resource groups, you know, is really important. I think not only for your own journey and professional growth in this area, but also just to see and bounce ideas off of other individuals and other groups. In addition, I think it's important, and many of us have alluded to this, that you meet people where they are. And this is really, you know, because everybody is at a different point, right? And so meeting individuals where they are is critical in really having growth and impact in this work. And then I think with respect to some other best practices is really building this into your organizational culture through training of your employees on a regular basis. So education of your employees on a regular basis has to be part of this process in order to really have impact. Building it into your guiding principles, to your performance evaluations. And again, that accountability piece is so very important as part of this work. The other thing I will tell you is to stay the course. And I don't know if my colleagues have experienced this or anybody else listening today, but sometimes when you're going about this kind of complex and very complicated work, you start to second guess yourself. At least I did. And partway through the journey, like, is this really going to work? You know, are we doing, we're being super courageous here, right? And we're trying to really have this impact. But it's a little scary sometimes along the course of the way. And so it's important to just remember that stay in the course. And even if you're going to second guess sometimes, you're going to get pushback. People are going to make mistakes. But this is really about dialogue and conversation and understanding. And just staying in that course is so very important. And the final thing I've learned thus far in this process is, as much as I want 100% buy-in in my organization, I really do, and I will always strive for that, you know, you may not get there, right? And so it's okay if you don't have 100% buy-in, because, you know, that might be something that just might be a little lofty or ideal. But as long as you can get the majority to buy into what you're doing, that is truly an organizational success.
That's excellent. And I would even add to that, you know, the push for buy-in, but to help those who are the dissenters know that this is not going away. So then they have to make a choice at some point as to whether or not they're going to embrace this, or it will be an awkward experience for them long term, because it's not going to go away. I think that's important too. Tina, your thoughts? Strategies, ideas?
I'm going to get some sort of specific. I think if we talk about inclusive leadership, it's about one of those aspects is about ensuring all voices are heard and that we can do perspective taking. So 2 really concrete actions we can take. 1, change who's running your meetings. So if you usually have one person running the meeting, rotate it. Make sure somebody else in the team is running the meeting every time. You immediately will change the dynamic in the meeting and give everybody a chance to do better perspective taking, especially the leader, the team leader. And then a second one related to meetings is put an empty chair in the room. In the game development sector, I found we often had a stakeholder not in the room. It could be an external partner. It could be the people playing our games. It could be somebody who was sick that day. There were time zone considerations because we were global teams. So by putting an empty chair in the room, we challenge everybody in the room in that meeting to say, what questions might they have for us? How might they be challenging the decisions we're making and the information we're sharing? What perspectives do we need to take? And then the final very concrete and explicit tip for inclusive leaders, I would say today, there's a lot of them I can think of, but get explicit about how you make decisions. Who's informed, who's consulted, who's accountable, who's responsible. Build that thought process out and make it transparent and communicate it. That is what inclusive leaders do. Because then because when we think about inclusion, part of it is missed expectations, right? If we don't have clear expectations of each other, we're disappointed. And so inclusive leaders pull us all together, keep us well aligned by ensuring we've got explicit processes for getting the work done and making our decisions.
That's great, Tina. I
I
love
wanted to
very
just
clear and
add,
concrete.
I like what Tina said, because almost every question and every technique that she just described was about equity. And so it was really taking the notion of equity and concretizing it. And so I really appreciate how you frame that, Tina, without actually even saying the word.
Thank you.
And that's a big part of the conversation for sure. Thank you, Tina. That was great. So we are about 10 minutes, a little less than 10 minutes out before we wrap up. And we promised participants that we would give them an opportunity to ask questions. And I'm guessing that those have been coming through over the last 50 minutes. So Shayla, is that a fair assessment that we've gotten a lot of questions? Yes. Okay. Unfortunately, we know we'll say up front, we won't be able to answer all of them, but we're going to try to get a few in before we wrap up. So Shayla, why don't you go ahead and share out?
Yeah, Tina just gave some really good examples, but there was a lot of questions asking for specific examples of what we can do. So if there's any more examples you guys have for that.
Okay, and let's get another question and I'll come back to that in just a moment. What's another question maybe?
What can we do to manage or prevent burnout for employees who have had this discussion many times?
Okay, great. So let's jump on that one. And then if you've got other ideas about other solutions, maybe Tina jarred some other thoughts, add that into your response. But Gary, I'll start with you. So how do we help prevent burnout?
It's such a good question. And I think the past year has been a good example of not only burnout, but people feeling isolated and by themselves a lot in addressing these issues. I know what we've done is we've promoted all kinds of ways for people to promote wellness, particularly mental health wellness, during a time when we have very, very little control over what's going on around us. But I think it's a really good question is what do you do when, people feel like we're having the same conversations and the same issues are emerging over and over again? I think it's a very good question to ponder.
That's great. Amri, anything you would add to that?
Oh, it's, we've been talking about diversity fatigue, and now we're talking about COVID fatigue. And I don't know if we could even separate the two, because COVID was a big wake-up call to the dynamics of difference and similarity or diversity at play around the world, and it's not over yet. And so I think, at the heart of this is a clarity about humanity that I don't think we've always had a clear conversation about. We've had a lot of conversations about identity, but we haven't necessarily talked about that greater circle of humanity that all of their identities fall inside of. And so for me, a big part of kind of reducing some of the fatigue is to begin to frame a little of our conversations about, how can we bring and rehumanize with one another all the time and make that kind of centerpiece of everything we do, because it keeps from that polarity that happens in a way that people start thinking this is about one group and not about we. And the humanity conversation, I think, could be ratcheted up higher than we've ratcheted it up, because there's been, you've seen some of those memes on house on fire, and you're watering the house that's not on fire. So we had to deal with race, and we still have to.
Right.
And if you don't understand that, the race conversation is not about Black people or brown people, it's about everyone. It's about humanity. I think that, to me, it gives me a sense of, I need to be thinking about this holistically, and I need to address the fires while they're there, but not forget that we can deal with the fire, but at the same time understand that there's bigger dynamics going on that we have to, be clear about the context of them so that everybody can get in and help fight the fire, so that humanity is uplifted, not just a particular group or an idea.
Yeah. That's great, Amri, and both of your comments just reminded me, Gary, I was thinking back to the conversation that you and I had on mental health just a few weeks ago. And burnout really certainly does fall up under that umbrella. And I think one of the ways that we can help to minimize burnout, we may not completely eliminate it, but at least being aware of it and being intentional about minimizing it, is I think the idea of shared responsibility is so important. So when we look at this work, not putting it on the shoulders of a select few, not just the CDO and not just people of color or marginalized groups to be the ones to keep educating, but expect that every single person in the organization, regardless of their role, has a responsibility to play in this. And that's where allyship comes in, right? And sponsors and mentors. And so when we spread the work and not put it just on a select few, I think that can help a lot in minimizing burnout and people feeling overwhelmed and feeling fatigued. Tina, I saw you had posted a few comments in the chat box about empathy and storytelling. You want to take a second or two to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, the fact that, and this touches on something that was said earlier that Dr. Schumacher said about not everyone being ready for this and not everyone's going to buy in. And so part of that is recognizing that and acknowledging that everybody's at a different place in their journey here. And that's okay. And we need to be, that's part of being inclusive, right? Is respecting, we're all in a different place in this conversation, having empathy and sharing the stories so that we can help build the perseverance to get through the tough moments. When we hear the stories and we make it more personal, then we can build empathy around us. So I think acknowledging that burnout's a real thing and people don't want to have these continued conversations, and that's okay. Let them step back. That's okay, because you can't bring everybody to the party. And you might want to try, and I want to say that we can, and I'd like to say that's going to be what happened. But my dad told me when I was a little girl, life isn't always fair. We're going to try and make it as equitable as possible, but it doesn't happen that way. So we just got to respect that we are all unique, we are all different, and be empathetic about the fact that not everybody's ready for this conversation.
Sure. Thank you. Dr. Schumacher, 60 seconds to add your thoughts to what's been shared. This is such a big one.
Oh, these have been great examples and I think great takeaways from this. And we have to remember that, oppression, whatever parts of society has been part of our world forever, right? And everybody, this fatigue is so, I love what Amri said. It's so, we have fatigue around COVID and just it's been crazy, the last 15 months or so. And just allowing people to know that, this truly does take time. And what our colleagues have said about individuals are at different places. And it is not about fighting. It is not about polarity. It's about humanity and just really figuring out a way to just take some time and listen and hear, appreciate, and value each other. And at the end of the day, that's what we should be trying to do, right? At the very end of the day, that's what it comes down to. So, taking some time to breathe and just know that, this is something that just takes a very long time, and enjoy and trust the process and the journey along the way.
Yeah, that's right. Celebrate that process and the progress. Absolutely. Gary, you had one other quick comment before I come in and wrap us up.
Absolutely. I was going to pick up on Amri's metaphor of putting fires out where they may not exist. We have a chief diversity officer at Harvard, Dr. Sherry Charlton, who said, you can't boil the ocean. And another metaphor is really of the ocean and how it's impossible to do if you go overboard and get too focused on every minute detail. So I think burnout comes from feeling like you have impossible goals in front of yourself. And don't boil the ocean kind of suggests what are some small bits and pieces you can really celebrate that you are doing so that, you won't feel burnt out because you feel like you are making progress as opposed to trying to boil the ocean where you're going to feel tremendous burnout.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And I purposely wanted to jump to that second question, Shayla, because I knew that some ideas and solutions, which is what people are looking for, would come out of that. So that burnout question was perfect for that. I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. Hopefully you got a lot out of what was shared. I know I did. And I think that if you can just take one or two things, that even just one thing that you heard from today and make a commitment to implement that, that can have a massive impact on our organizations going forward. So again, thank you all for joining us. Sorry we were not able to get to all of the questions. We will be looking at those, and they inform future webinars. So they have not gone to waste. And until next time, we will see you again. Thank you.